thank you again for being here. I know we'll be saying more about how many of you have come, but we had just an enormous response when we put out the invitation for applications to attend the event. We're just, again, honored by that. But also, it's deeply rewarding for us and exciting for us to see that there's so many teachers who are interested in this work and that want to partner with us in trying to improve civics education and to prepare the next generation of citizens and leaders for our country. So a little bit about the Institute of American Civics, if you don't know, was established by the state legislature and governor to advance civic education, to promote civil discourse, and to prepare Tennesseans for participation in our constitutional democracy. We had significant bipartisan support from the legislature, and we pursue these goals through offerings of courses at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, through K-12 outreach such as this, and public programming, and then other professional development opportunities. We are also housed in the Baker School of Public Policy and Public Affairs. It's named after Senator Howard Baker, who I'm certain you're all familiar with as Tennesseans. He was known as the Great Conciliator, and the Baker School carries forward his legacy of principled leadership, bipartisanship, and service. At the Baker School, we do have majors for undergraduates in public affairs and three graduate programs as well, including an MPA, MPP, and online MBA. Before saying any more, I do want to thank a few people who really made this event possible. The first person that I need to thank is Dr. Frankie Weaver. So Frankie, please give her a round of applause. Frankie has just an enormous work building this program. Our first Civics Academy was held 3 years ago. We had 49, 50 teachers, held one last year, 80, 81 teachers, and now we had over 125 register and be accepted to the program. So none of this would have been possible without her just really extraordinary work. I also want to thank Derek Griffin. Where's Derek? Derek, wait. Derek has also been with us from the beginning. He's a graduate student in the history department here at the University of Tennessee. We also have some undergraduate employees. Where are they? You probably saw them when you came through over here. There you go. So once again, thank you for your work. And then we also have, I believe, 16 interns from regional high schools, and they're sitting over there, if I'm correct, right? So thank you for your work. I also need to thank the Baker School events team, particularly Courtney Thompson-Hernandez and Elizabeth Woody. Courtney is somewhere. I haven't seen Elizabeth yet this morning. I also need to thank Teresa Fincham, who my assistant here in the IAC, who also is just an enormous work preparing this event. Also need to thank the Baker School communications team, particularly Emily Loden. You'll see her around. She's taking pictures, so smile for her over the course of the next 2 days. So why does civics education matter? Why does civics education, particularly now more than ever? We, of course, recognize that we need to prepare students to be informed, responsible citizens who understand their rights and duties. We think that civics education strengthens our institutions through knowledge, participation, and respect for the rule of law. We're equipping future leaders with the tools to think critically, engage civically, and act ethically. And we're promoting greater unity through a shared understanding of our principles and institutions. And we know that you are doing so much of this in your schools. I also want to add one other thing which I just read about a few days ago. It turns out that social studies education, civics education, is very important for improving literacy. There's been research showing that additional instruction in social studies does more to improve reading comprehension and literacy than actual additional instruction in ELA. So I know some of you probably do ELA as well, but I'm guessing that you are infusing your ELA curriculum with content-rich materials that come from your background as civics, history, and social studies teachers. So we think that your role is essential. We are honored that you are here. This is a highlight of the year for us in the Institute of American Civics. It's part of our core mission to reach the state of Tennessee. So thank you for being here. So now, it's my privilege to introduce our first speaker, Dean Marianne Wanamaker of the Baker School of Public Policy and Public Affairs. Dean Wanamaker has been at the University of Tennessee for 16 years. She joined the economics department, I believe, back in 2009. Then she also served on the President's Council of Economic Advisors. After returning from that, she ended up becoming appointed the director of the Baker Center. And then she navigated the process to turn the Baker Center into the Baker School of Public Policy and Public Affairs, which occurred really two years ago. She has just been an extraordinary leader for the Baker Center and the Baker School. It's really remarkable, the work that she did, turning a center into a school so quickly. And she's a distinguished labor economist, and when we were talking about topics that we should have people speak on, we thought that trade might be an interesting one. We didn't know how interesting it was going to be when she said that she would like to speak on that to you. So please join me in welcoming Dean Wanamaker to talk to you about how to teach about trade.
Thank you, Josh. Can you hear me? Am I on back there? Yeah, okay. I only regret that I can't talk to you about nuclear war. I know nothing about that. So I'm going to stick with my trade topic this morning. As Josh mentioned, I'm an economist. I spent 12 of my 16 years at UT in the business school. And I taught a class, and I'm going to wander. So if you can't see me now, you'll see me at some point. I taught a class in the business school, a business ethics class that I created myself. And the first thing that I did in that class every single year was I taught students about trade. When we say trade, I think sometimes the first thing that comes to our mind is trade across oceans, right? The ship comes from China, it unloads in LA, and the stuff comes all over this country. But trade is something that we all engage in every single day in our own backyards. I have been for years suggesting to my husband that there was absolutely no reason that I should be the one to cook. There are other people in Knoxville who like cooking. I don't like cooking, and so we could just engage in trade, and then I would never have to cook again. He has not agreed to that deal, but I am still working on it. And so I think we almost always take that trade topic and put it in an international context. But I want us today to be thinking about it both in the international context and in the context of our everyday lives. Trade is what makes us all able to flourish, what makes us able to consume more goods than we would otherwise consume. We're going to get into all of that. And so I want to start this morning by teaching you the game that I always used in my classrooms. When some of you have brought your students to the Baker School, and I run this game with them, these high school students, when they come to the Baker School. We do this game. It works, right? It's more complicated than you would want for perhaps freshmen, but I do think it's something that your students with a little bit of help can latch onto, okay? All right, so I'm going to start there this morning. And before I do that, I'm going to say that my goal for today is really help us think about trade in a much bigger perspective than we've been thinking about it traditionally. So one thing I want to talk about after we run this game, I want to talk about trade and the founding, right? Thinking about the original institutions of this country, the way that they were constructed. How did trade matter? The issue of trade matter? How did our founders decide they wanted to deal with it? I want to talk about the separation of powers. Who has power over trade, international trade in particular? We'll talk about that. And then I want to come all the way back to where I used, when I was teaching, this is where I would spend all of my time, is thinking about trade as a tool for economic growth. And my point in covering all of this is that whether you have U.S. history classes, whether you're teaching U.S. government, whether you're teaching economics, any of those three things, I want you to find something out of today's conversation to take back with you. All right? Okay, so I want to talk about a simple classroom experiment. You're going to need, I think you have it in front of you, some sort of paper and pencil. because you're going to have to do a little bit of math this morning. I'm sorry. Just a little bit. Thank you, Frankie. I knew she would have you prepared. By the way, I've been joking that when we first launched this institute, while you're getting your paper and pencil out, when we first launched this institute, this Teachers Academy 2 years ago, our guiding principle was we want teachers to come to Knoxville and feel like they have had a week at the spa. So I think Frankie misheard me and said, I thought I said a week at the sauna. So we're going to work on getting back to the spa in this air conditioning. But all right, so while you're getting your paper and pencil out, let me just go through the rules of the game. You can change everything about this, okay? All the context, you can change it in your classroom to suit your needs. This is how I usually do it. So I present to students that there are two countries. There's America and there's China. And there are two products. There's food and what I call manufacturers, which can be anything. It can be silly plastic toys, it can be cheap clothes, it can be weapons, it can be whatever. Things that you make in a factory. And then I give them two production schedules. Right? And I tell them, okay, if you're an American producer, food takes you 1 hour to produce every single unit. And manufacturers takes you 2 hours to produce every unit. And if you're Chinese, food takes you 4 hours to produce every unit, and manufacturers, again, takes you 2 hours to produce every unit. Okay, so if you're looking at that if you're an economics teacher, you're looking at that and you're thinking, I see where the comparative advantage is. I know how this is going to work. If you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, that's totally fine. It's not going to matter. All right, and then the rule is that every person, every producer has 12 hours in the day to produce. Okay, so what you're looking at is a production function. Okay, it's a way that a country is organizing its ability to produce output. These are the resources that they have, and the resources show up in this time that it takes to produce things. Okay, so at your table, start to figure out which of you is going to be American. Actually, everybody needs one partner is really the way this should work. So if some of you have odd folks at the table, that's fine. Maybe merge into two people into one person. But think about partnering off so that you have an American and a Chinese in every partnership. I'll give you a second to organize yourself that way.
Way over town, that's good to me. Oh, yeah.
Okay, do I have a bunch of American Chinese pairs? Everybody's good? Okay. All right, so production, by the way, y'all can't cheat. Those of you who know how this goes, no cheating back here. All right, so raise your hand if you're the American in your pair. Okay, so Americans, again, you're producing, right? And you have options for what to produce. So given this schedule, and you have 12 hours in the day, Americans could produce 12 units of food, or 6 units of manufacture, or some combination of both, right? There's no multitasking. So you can't be producing food and manufacturers at the same time. So if you spent 2 hours on manufacturers, you don't have those 2 hours to produce food. Does that make sense? It's one or the other. Okay, and then if you're Chinese, raise your hand. Okay, so you folks, again, you have options. You could produce 3 units of food. You could produce 6 units of manufacturers, or you could produce some of both, right? So how do you know what to produce? So the next slide gives you the rules that are going to tell us how we want to produce, okay? So on the next slide, what I'm telling you is that the consumption side of you, the previous slide was the production side of you, the consuming side of you doesn't want to consume just food or just manufacturers, right? People like consuming varieties. And the simple way of writing that out or helping people think about that is just to say, look, you want to consume things in pairs. So the consumer side of you wants one food and one manufacturer together, and if you get them together, you'll have 1 unit of utility. This is a very economics concept, but you'll have 1 unit of utility. And if you get 2 food and 2 manufacturers, you'll have 2 units of utility. But if you get them in mismatched amounts, it doesn't do you any good. So if you have 2 food and 5 manufacturers, you're still at 2 utility. Those extra 3 manufacturers didn't get you anywhere. Does that make sense? Just the idea of people like variety. Okay? So, let's go back. Let's suppose each one of you in your American-Chinese pair, you cannot trade. That's going to be round 1. So, American, you're on your own. Chinese, you're on your own. And you're both the producer and the consumer. So, you're looking at this production schedule, right? You've got 12 hours in the day. You can't trade. So whatever you produce, however you decide to spend your 12 hours, that's also what you're going to consume, right? And so the incentives here are, if you're American, you're not going to make 12 units of food because then you won't have any manufacturers to consume. So you're going to spread your time across the 2 products, both Americans and Chinese, all right? So take a second and figure out really quickly, what is it, if you're American, what's the combo that you want to produce and consume? And if you're Chinese, what's the combo you want to produce and consume? Again, you've just got the 12 hours to do that in. It's going to change every round.
Okay.
Yep.
So for this round, we want to manufacture more. We want more food than manufacturing. I want more manufacturing. Yeah. It is.
Did y'all figure it out? We'll find out if you figured it out. Yeah. Well, I didn't see when I do it in my classroom. I make it so that they're twice as many Chinese people as American people, so it gets way more complicated. And I make them get up and trade, and I'm not going to do that here. But. Okay, all right. So hopefully you've sorted out at your table, each one of you individually. When you can't trade, you've figured out how you want to spend your 12 hours. So any Americans want to call out how many units of food they're going to make?
4.
Oh, and how many manufacturers are you going to make? 4. And so what's your utility going to be? 4. So every American should be spending 4 hours on food to make 4 units, 8 hours on manufacturers to make 4 units. That's 12 hours total. You get 4 units of utility. Okay? Okay, so Chinese folks in the room, you want to call out how many foods are you going to make? 2. How many manufacturers are you going to make? 2. And your utilities 2. Okay, so again, you can change all of this. So sometimes when I run this in my classroom, I don't make it food manufacturers. I make it bread and fish, and then they have to make sandwiches to make that pairing concept easier. Right? You can do whatever. All right, so now you've got a partner. Okay, and now in round 2, you get to trade. Okay, so you're going to make your decision about production, but that doesn't have to be the same as what you consume, because after you produce, you get to trade with your partner. Okay, everybody good? All right, so I'm going to give you a second to work with your partner and figure out how y'all want to spend your 12 hours, how you want to trade, and then what your consumption is going to be. And they won't all the pairs won't come up with the same answer, but let's just work on it for a second.
Let's go ahead and say that we're on away from this because
No, so good at this. Sorry.
So really, manufacturing is like most of it for manufacturing and one food. More efficient at manufacturing.
Two foods and 2 units of manufacturing, 2 units of this. And then
Because we can trade.
Did y'all figure one out? Figure out a trade over here?
I am not very good at this. I can think only in generalities because I don't do math anymore.
Okay, so what's your intuition about what the Americans should be producing?
Oh, they gotta make more food.
They got to make food. So they just let them go all with that. So the American can make 12 units of food, and then the Chinese could make 6 units of food, right? Okay. And then what you can do, so you've got what the American has 12 units, the Chinese 6. You can trade however you want to do it, right? But okay. Yes. Yes. Which is that's where we're going next. Yes. Okay, how'd y'all do?
I can get 3 units of utility and she can get 5.
5. Okay. All right. Okay, listen up real quick. So again, everybody could have done this a little bit differently, but I'm going to interview this little trading pair right here, and they're going to tell you how they did it. Okay, so who's Chinese? All right. So tell me, how did you spend your production hours?
We focused on manufacturing. China had an advantage in how much manufacturing they could produce. America had an advantage in food, so we traded those two resources.
Okay, so as the Chinese participant in this trading, you made 6 units of manufactures. Is that correct? You went all in? Okay, and then as the American producer, how many units of food?
4 units of food and 2 units of manufacturing.
Oh, so you didn't specialize all the way? Not all the way. Okay, so then what did you do?
Then we executed a trade so that I could get my Midwestern farmers shipping grain to China.
Okay. All right, so you gave away some of that food and you got some manufacturers. Yes. Okay, and so in the end, what utility did y'all come up with? American, how much utility did you have?
5.
Okay, and then Chinese, how much utility did you have?
3.
3. Okay, so you started at 4 and 2, and you ended up at 5 and 3. Is that right? All right, raise your hand if your partnership came up with a way for both of you to be better off. Some of you. Raise your hand if you did not come up with a way for you both to be better off. Raise your hand if you got lost somewhere between the beginning and the end. Okay, all right. So let's do this. That's okay. That's good for how to resurrect an experiment that has gone awry. Okay, so what you can do, so think about if you're Chinese, they did kind of we're not going to specialize completely. I would encourage you, just specialize completely, okay? So that means the American can make 12 units of food, all right? The Chinese can make 6 units of manufacturers, okay? And then what you could do if you're Chinese is take 3 units of those manufacturers and trade them for some number of units of food, okay? And so if you send, let's see, or let me go back to what y'all did. I like what y'all did better. So y'all did a full specialization here, so you have 6 units of manufacturers, And then you did a partial specialization up there, so you had 8 units of food, is that right? And 2 units of manufacturers? Yes, okay. So when they're done producing, how many total units of food do they have? 8. And how many total units of manufacturers do they have? 8. Everybody see it? See how we got there? Everybody following? Okay, so we have 8 units of food and we have 8 units of manufacturers. We have 2 countries, and they get to split that up, all right? And so they were both before. We had 4 units of utility for the Americans and 2 units of utility for the Chinese, so we only had 6 utility units to start off with. We've now created 8, and so everybody can be better off, right? And the way they did that was to say American has 5 and the Chinese has 3. Okay, does that make sense? Everybody now following me? All right, so we started with, everybody good? We started with 6 total units of utility, 4 American, 2 Chinese. We jerry-rigged the manufacturing back here. We got 8 units, and we split them 5 and 3. And everybody's better off than they were before. Yes? Okay, good. I promise your high school kids can do this. Okay, so what happens, okay, what do you learn from that exchange? All right, so lessons you want a high school student to draw from an experiment like that. What do you want them to notice? Free trade is better, but what does better mean? Okay, we can raise living standards. That's the way I like to say it. We can raise living standards. Okay, so that utility, let's stop calling it utility and let's think about calling it something else. Okay, so we can raise living standards. I can consume more stuff if I'm in a positive trading relationship than I can consume if I'm not in that positive trading relationship. This is the argument I make to my husband. I would like someone else to do the cooking so that I can be doing whatever it is that I want to do, right, which is not cooking. Right? So that's one thing we want them to notice. Trade makes people better off from a consumption perspective. What else can they notice? Yeah. You need to, it's complicated. Okay? So now Adam Smith would say the invisible hand will work it all out. You don't have to think too hard. And he's right. And I used to tell my college kids, like, if I put y'all in a room and made y'all play this game 400 times, you would eventually get to the efficient outcome. But we can short circuit that by sitting down and everybody think real hard together about how we want to do this. Okay? Yes? What else do you want them to take away? The thing that I have found to be really valuable in a trade conversation with students is to make them recognize that when you have no trade, let's take China as an example. When you have no trade, you have both food manufacturers and manufacturers, so you have farmers and factories in China. When you open up to trade, what happened? You lost the farmers. They're literally not there, right? China, in our story, China specialized 100%, so you have factories, but you have no farmers, right? And so why is that an interesting observation? It's interesting because who's going to fight the free trade regime? Who wants it not to be free trade? Farmers in China. And also, right, in reverse, manufacturers in America, right? There's less manufacturing in this story in America than there was before. Or put another way, the farming sector in America wins, right, and the manufacturing sector in China wins. And so when you're thinking about the politics of trade, who wins and who loses, right, you can say consumers win from trade. They're better off. Producers are a mixed bag, right? If you're specializing in the thing that is disappearing under free trade, then you're worse off. Does that make sense? I think a lot of our conversation, our traditional conversations about trade policy sounded like that, right? And I know I have a high schooler who just went through her U.S. history class, and there's a lot of content in that U.S. history class about special interests, right, who want certain trade policies or want the government to tariff certain things or restrict trade on certain things. And those are stories about who loses, what producers lose under free trade, okay? Now, when I run this in class, I also sometimes add a restricted trade version, right? So somewhere between free trade and no trade is restricted trade, okay? And so there was a comment over here, which I loved. This couple right here wasn't 100% sure they wanted to do the whole specialization in trade thing, right? And the comment was, do I really not want to have any farming if I'm Chinese, or do I really not want to have any manufacturing if I'm an American? We ended up with some manufacturing, right? So they were inserting this caution of, I don't know that I want to go all the way. What if we just kind of did this partially? Right? So again, some kind of key things to pull out of this game. Trade makes consumers in both countries better off, but it can eliminate manufacturers in America and farmers in China. And if you add constraints on how much trade can flow across countries, that helps American manufacturers survive and Chinese farmers survive. Okay? But it would also lower consumer utility. And then this is the point that I use most frequently in class, that producers are the ones who have incentives to introduce trade barriers and restrict trade. It's never consumers, right? Consumers don't have those incentives in this game. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so now what I want to do for a few minutes is just talk about a little bit about how you might use a game like this to motivate a discussion of various topics in your classroom. And I really want to start with the founding. I think those of you, I've talked to a few wholehearted free traders in the room this morning, and every one of you who identifies as a free trader has said to me, gosh, this is so frustrating to watch this policy play out. Our trade restrictions are so counter to what I thought we wanted to do as a country, what I thought our trade policy was going to be. And so as I was thinking about this morning, it reminded me that there's so much about the colonial period and the Revolution and the early American period, those periods that are similar to the conversations that we're having today about trade. So I just wanted to bring up a few of those things and make those connections. So first, if you think about what is colonial America doing, colonial America is specializing in agriculture. And it is allowing the Industrial Revolution in the UK or in England to really take hold. Because what is happening is we are, in that story I just showed you, the Americans are doing what the Americans did in that experiment, right? We're going all in on agriculture, and we're letting our trading partner, Britain, go all in on manufacturers. And then we're trading back and forth, right? And so the statistics that I was looking at yesterday, 85% of the population in the colonies is engaged in agriculture, right? So we're living that trading experiment. And trade then is driving utility of the colonial population, because without those manufactured goods coming in from Britain, they literally could not have survived, right? So that trading back and forth was helping Britain industrialize, but it was also helping the Americans to survive because they could get the manufactured goods. And so the colonial population pays a ton of attention to trade policy, a ton. Right? And I think we sometimes think, oh, well, trade policy is something that that was just something they weren't paying a lot of attention to. And when they were thinking about independence and writing the Constitution, they weren't worried about it. But that, of course, is not true, right? And they really were in tune with what the trading policy was and what they felt like the British were doing to them through trade policy. And I commend to you, if you have time, Doug Irwin is an economic historian. He just wrote a book called Clashing Over Commerce. It's probably 5 to 10 years old at this point, and most of it is available free online. I've linked to it in your slides. And if you read chapter 1, just chapter 1 of that book, it gives you a ton of context about the way that the colonial America really thought about trade. So then if you think about, okay, what happens as the demands for independence build, a lot of those demands are rooted in trade policy, right? Are rooted in what they felt like the British were doing to them. I don't want to overstate that claim, but there is a lot of that. So in the Navigation Acts, rules about how the colonists could trade with the rest of the world. They had to trade through the UK. That was part of their long list of grievances. Of course, the Boston Tea Party is all about tariffs on particular goods. And then the colonists protested the British through non-importation strategies, okay? So basically, we're going to boycott you guys. You're not treating us well. We're going to boycott you. That wasn't a terribly credible threat because they didn't have any other way of getting manufacturers. But trade was a way in which each side of that conflict would express their disagreement with each other and a thing over which they fought. And so then when you think about what happens after the revolution, very quickly, and y'all know this story probably better than I do, but very quickly the states realized that without the British umbrella over trade policy, that they could all make their own trade policy. Okay, and so it was total chaos as every state decides what they're going to tariff from other states, right? So within the U.S., you have all of a sudden this kind of like, think about it like wildflowers of trade policy, and every state is, oh, we're going to raise revenue, okay, through trade. We're going to tariff things that are coming in. If I'm Virginia, I'm going to tariff what's coming in from Maryland. And they're protecting new industries that had shown up during the revolution, right? So when we go to war, then it's, well, you can't really rely on the British to supply all of your manufacturers anymore. We're going to have to make our own. And so those industries start to grow in the Northeast in particular. And when the war's over, there's a ton of incentive to try to protect those industries from trade, okay? And so you get this wild, wild west of trade policy. Congress, at the Constitutional Convention, they realize, holy crap, this is a mess. It's a big mess. We can't be successful economically if we're restricting our trade with each other within our own country. And the federal government needs a method to raise revenue. We have ceded that control to the states, and that's not going to work. Okay, and so they decide, okay, the Articles of Confederation as they're written are not going to work on this topic, and so they get organized around what do we want our kind of national strategy on trade to look like, and what you get is the Commerce Clause in the Constitution, which says that the federal government is the one that decides about interstate commerce. The states cannot do that themselves, and that takes out all the internal barriers to trade within the country, and then they say, who has the power to set those barriers to trade outside the country? Who is that? Who gets that power? The federal government, but who within the federal government gets it? Congress. Okay, great. So let's talk for a minute about separation of powers, right? So in the Constitution, of course, as you just stated, the power to regulate trade rests with Congress. And the power to regulate interstate commerce, the free flow of goods between states, and that reduces the state's power to regulate trade. So what happens in the Constitution is both about the separation of powers between the branches, but also removing state powers to regulate those same things. The executive branch, in the same stroke, of course, is given the power to negotiate foreign treaties subject to two-thirds ratification. That is, over time, interpreted to include negotiating foreign trade agreements. Okay, so at the beginning, the way that the founders sort of think about it is, okay, Congress is in charge of really all economic activity. The president has these national security and foreign affairs responsibilities, and trade belongs in the first category and not the second. And over time, what has happened is that trade has sort of evolved from being a purely economic policy question to being both an economic and a national security policy question. I live in a world of people, economists, who are really frustrated by the fact that the president has the power to set tariffs. Okay? And so what I read every single day is people saying, this isn't right, this is the power of Congress, and they point to these two specific acts of Congress where they say, look, Congress has ceded their power to the president. Raise your hand if you've heard this argument in the last 6 months. Yes, Congress, they're lazy, they're a bunch of fools, they decided they didn't want to do this anymore, and they handed their power to the president. Do y'all hear it that way? That's the way I hear it in my news cycles, okay? And the two things that they point to are the Trade Act of 1974 and IEEPA. And the Trade Act of 1974 is the one that contains what you've probably heard of just as Section 201, 232, or 301. And in the first Trump administration, this is where the administration leaned in on their power to regulate trade. Because they said, we can, under these sections of the Trade Act of 1974, we can regulate imports of steel, aluminum, Chinese manufacturers of all types, solar panels, washers, all the kind of very specific tariffs and trade policies that the first administration pursued. And it all lived under this Trade Act, right? The Department of Commerce has to write a report. They have to find that we're being mistreated on steel, aluminum, solar panels, and washers, and then the president has the power to regulate that. That's how it went. In this administration, the tool that the president has used is IEEPA. And IEEPA allows the president to declare a national emergency caused by an unusual and extraordinary threat to national security or the economy that originates in whole or substantial part outside the United States. It's effectively a national security story, right? So walking into this morning, I had been thinking so much about what I had been reading and that Congress had given their economic power to the president. But as I was thinking about what I wanted to share with you, I started to think about this a little bit differently. And I encourage you to maybe think about it a little bit differently and encourage your students to think about it differently. Which is that trade has become part of the president's national security strategy, and not just this president. It was also true for President Biden and to some extent for President Obama, that the regulation of trade isn't necessarily just about consumers and making consumers better off. It has become much more about producers and about our own national security interests. And those national security powers and our negotiation with foreign countries have always been powers of the executive, okay? And so I think we're at a pretty interesting time where it's not necessarily that Congress has ceded their power to the president, although certainly they have tried to do that, but also that the nature of what trade is and what it means to us as a country has also changed, okay? And when did that happen? And so just some ideas about that. One idea is that in the 1990s, if you'll remember, our country engaged in a lot of work on free trade agreements. Okay, can you name some of them? Yeah, that's the big one. Okay, but we also, in that period, China accedes to the WTO. Okay, and China becomes effectively a free trading partner, right? And so in that process, we took the economic kind of story behind trade and we put it on steroids. And we said, all trade all the time. It's just econ, okay? And then what happened was that some of our trading partners maybe took advantage of that and said, oh, well, if it's free trade, if it's all free trade all the time, okay, then I got some shady things I can do that can make America weaker. And it has turned into more of a national security story, okay? And so again, when you're thinking about like how you want to talk about trade policy and how it's playing out, I think it's too simple to say Congress ceded their power to the executive. I think it does us more good to talk about the ways in which trade has changed and the nature of the policy making has changed to be more of a national security story. Okay, questions, comments about that? Yeah. In which sense? Say more.
You said that there was some advantage possibly taken.
Yes, okay. Yeah, you're right. I'm speaking too vaguely. So what the story that folks will tell, those who really feel like that trade has become part of the executive branch's responsibility, are stories about the ways in which China in particular, but not just China, have used trade as a national security weapon, right? So let me give you a non-China example, and then I'll give you a China example. So a non-China example would be that this country has become entirely dependent on enriched uranium from what country? Does anyone know? Russia. Okay? So we cannot operate our nuclear fleet in this country without importing enriched uranium from Russia. And the same is true for most of Europe. Okay? And Europe is more reliant on nuclear, parts of Europe are more reliant on nuclear power even than we are. This wasn't really on anybody's radar screen until the Ukraine conflict. And in the Ukraine conflict, Russia started to use the fact that they were the sole source provider of enriched uranium to threaten other countries, right? And to say, you can't, if you support Ukraine in this conflict, then I'm going to pull your access to enriched uranium. Okay, so now, are we talking about a pure economic exchange, or are we talking about a national security concern, right? And then, if it's the latter, why wouldn't that be the president's purview, right? And then a Chinese example, of course, which I know many of you are aware of, is rare earth elements, right? The fact that the Chinese have effectively monopolized the supply chain in a bunch of things that we are really reliant on, right? So you might want to give me an example. Things we can't do by ourselves without the Chinese supply chain? Yeah, your phones. Yeah, our phones, lithium is one of them, but not the only one, right? And so my colleagues at UT say it's like in the periodic table, it's all the things you can't pronounce. Okay, so those things at the bottom of the table, right, come out of the ground and are refined mostly in China. And they hold a monopoly over that supply chain. And so in our current conflict, they shut that supply chain down. And they told American manufacturers, specifically the auto industry, you can't have access to this. And the auto industry squealed. This is 3 weeks ago, right? And they said to the administration, hey, you can't do this to us. We can't survive if we don't have access to those minerals. So the president negotiates, and they get a reduction. The Chinese get a reduction on tariffs to the U.S., and in return, the U.S. gets access to those supply chains again, okay? So that's another story where, is this trade? Or is this something else, right? And again, to the extent that it's something else and not just about economic incentives and trading, then it feels like, okay, this is an executive branch issue. Okay, good question. Other comments on that? Yeah?
So what about like our own multinational corporations basically doing damage to our own ability to manufacture things by seeking cheap labor elsewhere because labor is too expensive?
Can you, say your question again with the microphone, sorry. I'm mobilizing the mics, I guess. Go for it.
So the question is, don't our own multinational corporations bear some blame as well because they outsource labor to places where it's cheaper because labor here in America is too expensive?
Yeah, but the beauty of trade policy is that it mostly, though not always, treats multinationals just like anybody else. Okay, so if you're importing that good to the U.S., whether you're a multinational or not a multinational, you're paying the tariff, right? So the policy applies kind of universally. Where the exception to that is that in some legislation there will be country of origin rules that only apply to U.S. multinationals. And so there are ways in which Congress can work around that, but they don't typically do that. So, and certainly in our current moment, right, what the president's trade policies have been universal regardless of who's engaged in importing that product. Good question.
How can we account for changes in, like, I guess, global politics, be it war, famine, disaster, with free trade, if a country specializes and then they have like a failure in the supply chain,
Yeah.
Wouldn't having restricted trade support like the ability to be self-sufficient in the event of bad things happening?
Yeah. Yep. So you're introducing the concept of supply chain resilience. So let's talk for a minute then about, and students, by the way, are super good at this. Okay, let's talk about all the reasons why pure free trade isn't the right answer. Okay, even if we take the national security story out of it, what are all of the reasons why we might not want to embrace a full free trade regime? Okay, so you're raising one of them. And many of you who know the University of Tennessee, we have one of the world's best supply chain management departments. This is one of our great strengths on campus. And my supply chain colleagues tell me that in the run-up to COVID, it was there was just almost no deviation in their planning, meaning that they knew exactly what demand was going to be next year for their products. They knew from whence they were going to source the inputs for their products, right? It was almost boring, our job. So straightforward. And then COVID happens and all hell broke loose and their jobs became really hard. And what they have decided is they're never going back to the easy version. And the reason they're never going back to the easy version is that they had so fine-tuned their supply chains that they were single sourcing everything. Okay, meaning if I'm going to get this part, I'm going to get it from one factory in one country. And the incentives for doing that are enormous because the more you buy from the same place in the same country, the cheaper it is. When you dual source something, it becomes more expensive, right? And so the incentives are there. They get to COVID, some of these factories shut down, they can't get stuff out of China for months, and they realize, oh wait, there's a cost to all this efficiency. And so now the new world of supply chain management is, how do we mitigate risk by sourcing in two places that are unlikely to experience the same negative shock at the same time? Okay? Now, you can think about what the calculation looks like there, right? So what is the shock? Well, I don't know. It could be weather, it could be health, it could be regime change, it could be nuclear war, it could be all sorts of things. Okay, and so how do I think about two countries or two places that are unlikely to experience the same shock at the same time? That becomes a really complicated problem, but also is going to keep supply chain managers employed for a long time. So, great question. So there's one reason why we don't want to go full on free trade, right? Or we don't want to just fully make this thing fully efficient, is that when we hit a bump in the road, the consequences are enormous from only having that one source. Okay, what else then? Let's just skip to the end. I want to wrap up by thinking about the kind of classic economic growth story of trade. So I know those of you who are teaching economics, because I've seen your learning objectives for this topic, trade has been a consistent source of growth in incomes and purchasing power for the United States and countries around the world. Again, not just international trade, but also trade within our own borders has been true for this. But there are legitimate arguments for restricting trade, okay? And again, students, in my experience, students love this conversation. Like all the reasons why we shouldn't just have free trade, they come up with all sorts of things. All right, so let's talk about some of those reasons. So arguments for restricting trade. So one argument, and an argument that was very apparent at the founding, is what's called the infant industry argument. Right, and that is that if you have a new industry that's just getting up and going, and you have free trade, that new industry is always going to be undercut on price. They're never going to be the most efficient because they're new. Right, and so it's only fair or only reasonable, if you want that industry to survive over the long run, to protect it in the short run. And so you might say, okay, well, I really want the United States to have its own uranium enrichment program. Okay, so I'm going to restrict trade in enriched uranium to make sure that an American company can do that well. Right, now we're doing that in a different way than that. The way this country has decided to approach that is a heavy subsidy. Okay, so they basically said, you can freely trade uranium, but we're going to subsidize the heck out of American uranium for a little while. That company, those of you from this area, that company, one of the companies that's doing that just built a new place in Oak Ridge. Orano is the name of it. They just went on a big hiring spree. And so the federal government is weighing in on that trading relationship to say, oh, wait a minute, I want to make sure the American infant industry survives. And then, theoretically, at some point, we will stop subsidizing Orano and they'll be on their own, right? But right now, we can't do that because they're just getting going, okay? So that's one reason we choose to restrict trade. National security reasons, okay? So we might say we're going to add some tariffs to these critical minerals coming out of China, so that American producers of those same products can be competitive. They can't be competitive as it is, but if we add tariffs and those products become more expensive, then American producers of those minerals may be competitive. So that's a national security argument. And then vertical foreclosure is an econ term, but it basically means we don't want any country to be a monopolist over anything that we rely on, because that puts us in a really weak position, okay? And so, again, you can think about the kind of critical minerals story as meeting that definition as well. You also will hear companies argue for trade restrictions based on unfair competition or dumping, right? The idea that, for example, this is a story that gets told about steel and aluminum, that the Chinese government is selling steel and aluminum to the United States at a price less than the cost of production. Why would they do that? Why would the Chinese government support selling steel and aluminum to the U.S. at less than the cost of production? Yes?
Because if they do that long enough, it drives out all the American manufacturers, and then they can raise prices for the whole
Yes. Okay, so it's a strategy to get to vertical foreclosure. So what she said was, if you do that for long enough, then the American companies can't survive. They'll close, okay, and then the Chinese exporter has no competition and they can raise prices back to what they want, okay? So it's a long-term strategy that typically requires government support, right, to clear out your adversaries or your competitors so that at the end of the day, you become the monopolist, right? We also see, especially in this administration, protection as a bargaining chip in a broader international relations strategy. And then there are other national security arguments. The one thing I wanted to make sure we hit on today is the story about using trade policy for revenue, right? So this came back in the first Trump administration. This was a topic of conversation. Hey, let's earn revenue on tariffs. And then in this administration, it has really been a topic of conversation. Can we reduce the deficit or lower taxes on Americans by raising revenue using tariffs on trade? If you go back in history and you look at the colonial period, what would you say about that? Do what?
Basically, this is how the federal government funded itself along with land sales until the 16th Amendment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, so if you took a purely historical view of this, you would say, yeah, that's super reasonable, right? Like, we did this for years. This is how the federal government funded itself. As you said, it was land sales and tariff revenue. That's how we made money. So why wouldn't we do that again? So what are the arguments today about using tariffs and trade policy for revenue generation? What do you hear about that? Yeah, right here.
Well, the biggest one is it passes the cost on to the consumer.
Yes. Okay, so one thing is, yes, you can raise revenue that way, but it's revenue that you're earning from American consumers, right? And foreign participants as well, right? It's not just on American consumers, but American consumers are paying the tax, the tariff tax, or most of that tariff tax. And so it's not we're going to lower taxes on Americans and raise taxes on foreigners through tariff revenue. We're going to lower taxes of one type and raise taxes of another type. And typically we think about tariffs as being a very regressive tax, meaning you're taxing things that low-income Americans consume as it's a greater share of their income than it is of higher-income Americans. Okay, so specifically you think about tax all of Walmart, right, with a tariff, that's a really regressive tax. Yes?
What about getting rid of income tax? We didn't have that before in 1913.
Say that again?
Getting rid of income taxes. We didn't have that before 1913.
We didn't have it before 1913. Yeah, right. So the question is like, hey, let's just go back. Let's just get rid of the income tax. Let's just earn everything. Let's just earn our national budget on tariffs. Can we do that? Yeah, unfortunately, unfortunately, the budget's too big for that. The things that we would tariff aren't a big enough share of our expenditures for that to make sense. So in other words, if I wanted to really cover the entirety of the federal budget or a big share of the federal budget or the share that's currently covered by federal income taxes with tariffs, they would be so high that no one would buy the thing that you're talking about tariffing. Okay? All right, what else? What else do we hear today? Yeah.
I just want to ask about the politics of this because in the 90s, like you said, both parties were very free trade, pro-free trade. Now the Democrats' opposition to it, I think, is driven mostly by labor and environmental concerns. But the Republicans in the 2000s were much more pro-free trade than the Democrats were. President Obama under TPP, his own party sank his own agreement. But now under Trump, the Republican Party has dramatically shifted. And I just would wonder if you can kind of comment on what's happened to the Republican Party that was so pro-free trade and now under Trump has gone all in on, not even just tariffs on individual industries, but even like blanket tariffs on everything.
Yeah. So if you're a free trader, you have no party. I was listening this weekend to an interview with a congressman from California, a Democrat, and he was encouraging his party to become the party of free trade. And I was like, what planet am I on? And it was just so jarring for the same reason. So I can't, the stories about why this has happened, there are a million different theories. The biggest one is that, I think, the one that holds the most weight, is that go back to our original experiment. When you move from no trade to free trade, all consumers win, half of producers lose in our story, right? So the consumption side of all of us is better off with cheaper goods at Walmart. The producer side of us is not necessarily better off. And folks in this country who had specialized in the things that now we don't have a comparative advantage in are without jobs. And those costs, those losses, are geographically concentrated. And you can see it not in the South as much, but you can see it more when you go to places in the Midwest, the industrial base that got decimated from years of basically losing the market to other countries. What economists will tell you is that that is a valid story, but most of those job losses weren't related to trade policy. And simultaneous to trade policy was a huge increase in automation. We worry about automation now, but automation was really a 1990s, 2000s story in factories. And so economists would say, even without all that free trade, you would have had the same geographic concentration of job loss from automation, which is nearly impossible to stop. I mean, presidents have considered in the past, if you can imagine this, a tax on robots. We considered it in the first Trump administration. We had a whole conversation about a tax on robots. I was like, I cannot believe I'm having this argument. Like, I don't think you want to tax the robots, but maybe. But automation is a really hard process to stop. Okay, like how would you do that? And so that has been a place where the federal government has been mostly helpless, the automation side. You see it now too, by the way, right? As we talk about AI, like suppose you wanted to put a stop to AI. What would you do? How would you do that? I mean, Andy can't stop it in his classroom. I can't stop it in my classroom. So I don't know how you're going to prevent a manufacturer or a factory from adopting AI, right? And automation was the same thing. So that has been part of it. And then I think we've had a narrative that the shifts in the economy were attributable to our trade policy. Some of those shifts are attributable to our trade policy. But again, economists would say most of those shifts were going to happen anyway. But trade is a really good scapegoat. And then if you want your government to do something, what do you ask them to do? You ask them to give up on that free trade policy, right? I want to go back to the way it was before. And so that, I think that's the current dynamic that we're in. Yes, sir? Yeah. Will you stand up?
So, I guess my question is with the restricting trade, how does that affect the U.S. and the G7 and the BRICS countries? Like, is that not giving an advantage to the BRICS on our GDP and then surpassing us or equaling our level of development?
Yeah, so good question. So this is going to be my last comment, so I need to wrap up. But I don't have it with me today, but I have a slide that I use when I talk to audiences like this that shows for the last 20 years, the G7 countries, I don't put BRICS on there, but I put the G7 countries, which are, help me, Canada, Germany, the UK, Italy, Canada, did I already say them? France, US. Am I missing one? Did I get them all? Okay. Your peers. We're thinking about them as these are our peers, okay? Italy, questionable. I usually actually don't put them on the slide. But anyway. So, and then it shows, like, for the last 20 years, how is everybody's economic performance? And let's measure that by GDP, okay, output. How's everybody doing? Right? And the answer to that, and I wish I had it with you, but, like, you see a whole bunch of European countries just flatlining. Then you see the US and Canada just doing like this. Canada hiccups with COVID more than we hiccup, and then we have continued to accelerate, and Canada has slowed down, right? But they're still way better than our European peers. So it's hard to look at that slide and not think like, okay, we're doing something right, right? From an economic growth perspective, this country has been humming. Then you get the Trump administration who comes in and says, we really want to reduce the amount of foreign trade. We want to throw up barriers. We want to reduce immigration. Both a reduction in immigration and a reduction in foreign trade, both will affect the rate of growth of GDP. But I will tell you this, even economists who are so upset at this administration and really feel like this is a terrible idea, when they add it all up, like how much of our growth are we putting at risk, we're still going to grow faster than everybody else. Okay, so think about it this way. We've been growing on average about 2.5 to 2.7% per year for the last 20 years. And the best estimates of what does it mean to reduce trade like this administration wants to do, that pulls off maybe 0.2. And then if you want to take immigration, that's maybe another 0.3. Right, so we're going to go from, okay, we were growing at 2.5 to 2.7 to, okay, we're growing at 2 to 2.2. That's less, okay, and I hate giving that up, but we're still growing a lot faster than the rest of the world. So it's kind of a, glass half empty, half full sort of question, but it does give other countries the opportunity to catch up if they can get their acts together. Good question. All right. Thank you all for having me.